Hi, my name's Scott Naismith and I'm a landscape painter. Today I've got a tutorial for you, and I've called it painting with freedom, but it's not necessarily what you might think with freedom as being the biggest, boldest brushstrokes. It's actually about painting with the freedom of a new and better type of way to perceive what you're putting down on canvas. We all tend to, quite rightly, learn how to draw first and foremost, and drawing is all about line. When we see the transition of one object to another, we are drawn quite literally to draw the line at which those two objects meet. Painting, however, is much more to do with the shapes, and laying down the shapes of the forms and the shapes of the colours that we see. And we should be able, as artists, to concentrate on some transitions and suggest others. In oil painting, what we need to be conscious of is where we create these lines within our paintings, which we call, as painters, edges. The edge between one brushstroke and another, the edge between one object and another. And sometimes the edges between where the light shifts or where the colour shifts is more important than the edge between two objects. So I'm going to speed this painting up to maybe 3 times speed and just talk you through some of the thought processes that I would be going through my head when doing it. Okay, so to kick off this sort of study at the start, I've got a brown base of burnt umber, burnt sienna in there as well, just to warm up the background, also to kill the white of the canvas and to give me a base to work on. So in a pretty conventional way, I'm setting out the line work, but it's only to get the positioning of the objects and to have the spatial awareness of a composition there, so that I know where I am at the start, not necessarily to do any details whatsoever with line. Not that there are any details in this little study, being 3 spheres to give you an idea of a little bit about reflected light and the way that something with quite a hard edge can be described with a fairly soft edge because of what's happening with the light. Okay, so at this stage I've set the latest light as not being touched yet. I've sort of set that by taking back the initial wash layer with a rag, just to set how light that latest light is going to be, and then I've contrasted that with the darkest darks, which is the shadow that it casts. This isn't being produced from life, it's just being produced from imagination. So I'm trying to imagine a light coming in from the left and casting shadows towards the right. What's very important with this method of losing edges and blending some edges and suggesting some edges is that you keep the background and the object going at the same time. The beauty with oil paints is that you can sort of streak some colour from the background into the object, some colour from the object into the background, and then there will be a unity there because of that, and you can then begin to soften those edges through just the use of using your background brush clumsily across the line of the object. And so this sort of freer way of using oils is really so that you don't get bogged down with the detail at the start. At the beginning of the painting, you are already thinking about light and colour as much as the objects themselves. So instead of analytically drawing out every edge and every detail, we're getting an essence for a scene or an essence for the objects. All the edges and where the objects lie and the accuracy of them can all be adjusted later on, and what's more important is that we get the transition of light and shade and an expressive use of brushes and brushwork. What you also find with this process of painting is that you are working on the whole painting at once. You're not just concentrating to a finish on one section, you're working right the way through the painting. And what that allows you to do sometimes with olive paintings that you wouldn't do otherwise is kind of leave much of the painting kind of half finished, because often at this stage of the painting it's possibly more interesting than the final piece itself. So what we're always trying to do with this kind of style of painting, this freer style of painting, is that we're trying to refine the painting towards the end, and just pushing around the paint to get an accuracy. At the moment, these highlights are going on, and what I've done is place the highlights on in thicker paint, and then using that thicker paint to then blend across to get a glow to the highlight. At this stage of the painting, I'll be working with much softer brushes. So generally with this method of working, you're starting off with the stiffer hogshair brushes, and then by the end really using some of the softer brushes which are able to place the paint on top of the previous layers of paint. Much of this style of painting is just getting the physical paint onto the canvas and then just using the brushes to manipulate the paint around. Quite often I'll use a palette knife to apply the paint, getting the paint onto the canvas first of all, setting the colour and the tonal values, and then I'll fine tune it with a softer brush. So at the moment what we're seeing is a development of the shadow areas, and the shadow areas are going to have a little bit of cool colour in them. In this case, when cool colour is brought in, we start to get a purpley colour happening in the shadows. And I've deepened the shadows much deeper than they are going to be, but then the shadow area will start to blend with the lit area. But also what's going to happen is I'm going to introduce some reflected light. Now you'll notice that the shadow area doesn't go all the way to the edge of the spherical object. What I'm going to inject is a little bit of the greys and the cooler greys from the surface onto those areas after the shadow, and that will describe the reflected light. Again, the beauty about the oil paint is that you can just use that same brush and start to blend some of the colour from the background into the object itself. And quite often you can take a completely clean brush and just lift some of the colour from the background and start working that into the object. A lot of work in oil painting can be done with just brush and no paint. You're painting with fresh air, you're just manipulating the paint around the canvas that you've already applied in much more vigorous brush strokes. The actual application of these brush strokes has actually been done very, very softly. So the key to having a good, strong brush stroke is load up the brush with plenty colour, and by all means wave it across the canvas very quickly and very confidently. But what we're doing is not putting too much on to the canvas itself. You don't really want to use the whole of the brush. You only really want to use the top third, really, to paint with. And the pressure that's being applied on the brush is relatively soft, even for the most vigorous looking brush stroke come the end. The beginning of the painting is when the paint's really scrubbed in, but when we're trying to preserve those brush strokes at the end with the soft brushes, not a lot of pressure is needed. What to notice here is that all edges of the painting, and at the beginning of the tutorial I did mention this, it was all about edges. There are in this painting what most people would consider as three basic shapes here, but there's much more than that. The basic shapes are the three objects, but it's the shapes within that, it's the shapes of the shadow, the shapes of the light, and we're concentrating on that mostly. And what I'm trying to achieve is a graying of the areas where you are showing the transition between one object and another, so that the edges between background and object and one object and the other are often softened. So ultimately what I'm trying to get at with this tutorial is the concept that the biggest thing holding back the novice painter who's trying to progress from drawing to painting is actually the ability to draw itself. And what you learn when you draw, everyone starts out drawing by drawing line and understanding where objects finish and where objects start, and describing that as a hard line. Now, to begin to understand what painting's all about, you almost need to unlearn all of that. Line is just the guideline as to where objects lie, and it has just a structural bearing on your painting, but shouldn't limit it. So what we're trying to do is paint outside the lines in a very simplistic way. And it's all really about positive shapes and negative shapes, and this tutorial that I've chosen to do here with the three spheres is taking the positive shape of the spheres, the negative shape of the grey background, and keeping them both going at the same time. And in doing so, we create the line in between the two. And as I'm painting the background, I'm painting it closer and closer to the object, and actually painting over the line of the object. And then when I come to paint the object, I paint closer and closer to the background. And the point at which the object turns away from us, it will actually be describing some of that reflected light from the background colours onto the object. Other harder edges are described to draw the attention to certain places where we want the eye to settle. Others are just suggested. So this process of losing line is absolutely key to oil painting. I'm just finishing up here, just adding a little bit more of that reflected light and adjusting some of the highlights. But the next tutorial will be about glazing over this and getting a depth, both a depth to the shadows and also transitions in colour. and brightening of colour. I've already done a glazing tutorial, but it'll be interesting to see how glazing will affect this little exercise here. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe to me on Twitter and join me on Facebook as well. Until next time, thanks a lot. See you later.